The lawyer was already sitting in my grandmother's old wingback chair when I opened the door, still wearing my black coat, still carrying the program from the service in my hand. I remember the program because I had been folding and unfolding it the whole drive home from the cemetery in Mount Pleasant, creasing my father-in-law's name into the paper until it was soft as cloth. Harold James Whitfield, 1941 to 2026. Beloved father, grandfather, and friend. Nothing on that program about me. Nothing about the 12 winters I had spent buttoning his shirts and cutting his food into pieces small enough for him to manage with his left hand after the stroke took everything on his right side. They had not waited for me. That was the first thing I noticed. My husband Bruce was sitting on the love seat with his sister Colleen. His younger brother Douglas stood by the window looking out at the snow falling over the backyard, the same backyard where Harold used to sit in his wheelchair and watch the chickadees come to the feeder I filled every morning. And there was the lawyer, a man I had never seen before in my life, with a leather folder balanced on his knees and a pen already in his hand. "Margaret," Bruce said. "Not sweetheart, not Marg. Just Margaret, the way you would say the name of a stranger you were about to serve papers to. Take off your coat and sit down. We need to talk about a few things." I did not take off my coat. I stood just inside the door with the snow melting off my boots onto the mat. I had braided myself the winter Harold first came to live with us, back when Bruce still kissed me on the forehead before he left for the shop, back when our son Ethan was still in high school, and the house on Larkspur Lane in Guelph was full of the noise of a family that believed in itself. I stood there and I looked at my sister-in-law Colleen, who had not come to the hospital once in the last 2 years of her father's life, not even when he was asking for her by name in the delirium of his final week, and I understood that whatever was about to happen had already been decided without me. "Who is this?" I asked, nodding at the lawyer. "Mr. Thorne is the family's solicitor," Douglas said. "He said family the way a man says a word he has just learned and wants to try out. He's here to read Dad's will." "Here," I said. "You're reading your father's will in my living room." "Our father's living room," Colleen said. That was the moment I understood. Not when Mr. Thorne cleared his throat. Not when Bruce refused to meet my eyes. It was Colleen saying "our father's living room" in the house I had scrubbed and painted and decorated for 12 years, in front of the fireplace where I had read aloud to Harold from the Globe and Mail every morning after his second stroke because the letters on the page had started to swim away from him. I sat down. I kept my coat on. Mr. Thorne opened his folder. He had the polished sort of voice that lawyers from Toronto develop, the kind that has been rubbed smooth by money. He began to read, and I listened the way you listen to a weather report about a storm that is already over your house. Harold Whitfield, being of sound mind, the property at 42 Larkspur Lane, Guelph, Ontario, to his son Bruce Whitfield, the family cottage on Lake Simcoe to his daughter Colleen Whitfield McRae, the RRSPs, the TFSAs, the GICs at the Royal Bank, all divided evenly between his 3 children, Bruce, Colleen, and Douglas. The 1,974 Ford pickup truck, which had not run in 8 years, to his grandson Ethan, to his daughter-in-law Margaret Whitfield, in recognition of her service in his final years, the sum of $5,000. $5,000. 12 years. I did the math in my head the way a nurse does, because that is what I used to be before I left Guelph General to look after Harold full-time. 12 years is 144 months. 5,000 divided by 144 is $34.72 a month, $1.15 a day. I had paid more than that for the Tim Hortons coffee. I bought myself every Tuesday morning as a small private reward for surviving another week. Mr. Thorne was still reading. I had missed a sentence. I asked him to go back. "Furthermore," he said, reading it again slowly, as if I were a child, "the deceased requests that Margaret Whitfield vacate the property at 42 Larkspur Lane within 48 hours of the reading of this will, to allow the new owner, Bruce Whitfield, to take possession. 48 hours. I looked at Bruce. He was studying the carpet I had chosen from the outlet store in Kitchener the year Ethan started at the University of Waterloo. "Bruce," I said. My voice came out quieter than I meant it to. "This is our house. We bought this house together." "It was in Dad's name," Bruce said. He still did not look up. "The last refinance. Remember. When we helped him with his bills after the first stroke, We put the title in his name so the Ontario government wouldn't take it for his care costs. We always said we'd put it back, we just never got around to it. I remembered. Of course I remembered. It had been my idea. I had read about it in a pamphlet at the community health center, and I had suggested it to Bruce over supper, and we had laughed together about how clever we were, keeping the house in the family. I had trusted my husband of 34 years the way I had trusted the ground under my feet. I had never once imagined he would use that trust to stand on my neck. 48 hours, I said. Margaret, there is no point making a scene. Colleen's voice was the one she used with customer service representatives at Bell Canada. Daddy was very clear. You were paid. You had a roof. Now the arrangement is ending. Honestly, $5,000 is generous. Most live-in caregivers in this country work for nothing. I have thought about that sentence many times in the months that have followed. I have thought about all the women across this country, from Victoria to Street, Johns, who are right now this minute cutting up somebody else's mother's toast and wiping somebody else's father's chin, and how many of them are being told, in rooms they believed were their own, that they are generous to have been allowed to do it. I stood up. I am 61 years old and my knees are not what they were, but I stood up like a woman 20 years younger. I'll have my things out by Thursday evening, I said. Then I walked past my husband and up the stairs to the bedroom we had shared for 34 years, and I closed the door behind me, and I did not cry. I have told this story to 3 people now, and every one of them has asked why I did not cry. I did not cry because there was a voice in my head, old and calm and familiar, and the voice said, "Not yet, Margaret. Not in front of them. Not yet." I packed a single suitcase that night. My nursing scrubs, which I had not worn in more than a decade but had never been able to throw away. My mother's prayer book. The photograph of Ethan graduating from Waterloo. The silver locket Harold had given me the Christmas before his second stroke, with a tiny picture of his late wife Eleanor inside, because he had said, "Margaret, you have loved my family better than her own blood, and I want you to have something of hers." I put the locket on under my turtleneck and I felt it cold against my skin, and that was the only moment that night I came close to weeping. I left at 6 a.m. The house was still dark. Bruce was snoring in the guest room. He had not even had the decency to sleep in our bed. I drove to my older sister Frances's place in Fergus, 25 minutes up the road, and Frances took one look at my face and put the kettle on without asking a single question. It was the next evening, sitting at Frances's kitchen table with a cup of red rose tea going cold in front of me, that I remembered the envelope. Harold had pressed it into my hand on a Tuesday afternoon in October, about 6 weeks before he died. The leaves were still on the maples. He had been having one of his clear days, the kind that came less and less often toward the end, when his eyes would sharpen and he would look at me like the man I had first met in 2014, rather than the frail shape the strokes had left behind. He had reached under the blanket on his lap and brought out a thick manila envelope, sealed with packing tape, and he had pushed it across the tray of his wheelchair toward me. "Margaret," he had said, "put this somewhere safe. Somewhere in your own things, not in the house. Promise me." I had asked him what it was. "Insurance," he had said. And then he had laughed, a dry laugh that had turned into a cough, and when the coughing stopped he had said, "If anything doesn't sit right after I'm gone, you open this. If everything sits fine, you burn it. But open it before you burn it, Margaret. Promise me." I had promised him. I had taken the envelope out to my car that same afternoon, and I had put it in the glove compartment under the owner's manual, and I had honestly forgotten about it in the whirl of the last 6 weeks of his life, the hospice nurses coming in, the hospital bed replacing his armchair in the den, the morphine schedule pinned to the fridge. The envelope had ridden around Guelph in my glove compartment for 6 weeks, while Harold was dying, and I was driving to the pharmacy for his medications and to the grocery store for the soft foods he could still swallow. I told Frances. I put on my coat and my boots, and I went out to my old Subaru, and I opened the glove compartment, and there it was, the same manila envelope, a little more creased, a little more weathered, with Harold's shaky handwriting on the front. For Margaret, only. I brought it back into the kitchen. Frances got up and poured 2 glasses of the Shiraz she had been saving for Christmas, and she said, "Whatever is in there, Marg, we are going to handle it together." I cut the packing tape with a steak knife because my hands were shaking too much for scissors. Inside the envelope there were 3 things. The first was a letter, 6 pages long, in Harold's hand. I will not write out the whole of it here, because some of what Harold said to me in that letter is for me alone, and I will keep it that way until the day I am buried next to my own people in the cemetery at Fergus. But the first paragraph I will write, because it changed everything. Margaret, it began. If you are reading this, then my son has done the thing I have been afraid he would do since the day Douglas first put the idea in his head. I have known about the plan for almost 2 years. I have said nothing, and I have let them think I was a doddering old fool because I needed time to protect you. Before you go any further, I want you to know that every word of what Mr. Thorne read out in my living room is a lie. The will he read is not my will. My real will is with a woman named Jessica Bowden at the law firm of Bowden & Singh in downtown Guelph. The document I am about to tell you about is the proof. The second thing in the envelope was a USB memory stick in a small padded pouch. The third thing was a photocopy of a will, signed by Harold and witnessed by 2 of the nurses from the hospice team, and notarized by a Jessica Bowden. Real will of Harold James Whitfield, it said in Harold's own capital letters across the top, in case they destroy Jessica's copy. Frances plugged the memory stick into her laptop while I sat there with my hand on the locket under my turtleneck, feeling Eleanor's picture cold against my collarbone. There were 6 audio files on the stick. Harold had dated them. The first was from the summer before last. He had hidden a small digital recorder under the arm of his armchair, the kind sold at the source for recording lectures. He had turned it on before his son came to visit him. I listened to all 6 files that night. I listened to them twice. By the end of the second listening, Frances was crying and I was not. I was a long way past crying. I was somewhere cold and clear and useful, the place I used to go when a patient coded on my shift and I had to keep my hands steady on the compressions. On the files, Bruce and Douglas and Colleen discussed, in detail, over the course of 18 months, the plan to have Harold's real will destroyed and a false one substituted, drafted by a corrupt paralegal in Hamilton who would take a cut of the estate. They discussed how to push me out of the house before I had time to contact a lawyer. They discussed whether to bother giving me anything at all, and Colleen had said $5,000 would look respectable without encouraging me to fight. They discussed, on a recording from last spring, how much Dad had left them, and Douglas had laughed and said, "The funny thing is, Marg actually thinks he likes her." I remember the moment I heard that sentence. I was holding Frances's hand across the table. I stopped holding it. I did not let go because I was angry with Frances. I let go because I needed both my hands flat on the wood of that old pine table to keep myself still. I looked at Frances and I said, very quietly, "Fran, we are going to need a lawyer of our own." Frances said, "Already ahead of you, Marg." The next morning I sat in the downtown Guelph office of Jessica Bowden, who turned out to be a woman about my son's age, with close-cropped gray hair and a framed commendation from the Law Society of Ontario on her wall. She had been expecting me. Harold had told her, in their last meeting in September, that if a woman named Margaret Whitfield ever walked into her office carrying a manila envelope, she was to drop everything. Jessica Bowden read Harold's letter. She listened to 2 of the audio files. Then she put her pen down on her desk and she said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I have been practicing estate law in this city for 27 years, and I have never in my career seen a file this clean. Your father-in-law," she said, "was a very careful man. Harold's real will, filed with the Ontario Probate Court 3 weeks before his death, left the house at 42 Larkspur Lane to me. Not to Bruce. To me, Margaret Ann Whitfield, in gratitude for 12 years of care that no amount of money could repay. It left the cottage on Lake Simcoe to my son Ethan, with the instruction that he was to welcome his cousins there whenever they wished to visit. It left the RRSPs and the TFSAs divided among all 3 of Harold's children, and equally to me, a full 4th share. It left Harold's share in the auto parts shop in Guelph that he and Bruce had run together to a local trust to be administered for the benefit of stroke survivors across Wellington County. And it contained one additional provision, which Harold had added in the last week of his life. A paragraph stating that if any of his biological children contested the will or attempted to produce a document purporting to be a different will, that child would be disinherited entirely, with their share to be added to mine. Jessica Bowden looked up at me across her desk. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "Your father-in-law has done something extraordinary here. The false will your husband presented to you on Monday," she said, "constitutes fraud under the criminal code. Forgery of a will is an indictable offense. You have a civil remedy," she said, "and you also have a criminal one. It is up to you how you want to proceed." I asked her for a day to think. I drove back to Francis's house in Fergus. I sat on the porch in my coat with a cup of Nescafé because Fran had run out of the good tea, and I watched the snow come down over the fields behind the house, and I thought about my son Ethan, who was still in Calgary working for the oil sands company, and who did not yet know that his father had done any of this. I thought about the 34 years I had spent with Bruce, the years before Harold, the years when we were poor and young, and I was doing night shifts at the hospital, and Bruce was building the shop up from nothing, and we used to split a single cinnamon bun from the Stone Store bakery between us, because we could not afford to. I thought about Colleen, who had cried at her father's graveside loud enough for the people in the next row to hear. I thought about Douglas laughing on the recording. Then I thought about a woman I had cared for on one of my last shifts at Guelph General, an old lady from Kitchener named Mrs. Henderson, who had been brought in with a broken hip after her son-in-law had shoved her down the stairs of her own house so his wife could inherit faster. Mrs. Henderson had held my hand in the recovery room and she had said, "Dear, the worst thing is not what they do. The worst thing is that you let them do it a second time by staying quiet." I went back into the house. I told Francis I was going to prosecute. I filed the criminal complaint with the Guelph Police Service on a Friday morning. Jessica Baudouin came with me. I handed over copies of the letter, the real will, and the audio recordings. The officer who took my statement was a young woman from Orangeville who kept her face very professional until the end of the interview, when she closed her notebook and said, quietly, "Ma'am, I hope you take them for everything they've got." The civil suit was filed the same afternoon. I will not give you the full chronology of the months that followed because much of it was a blur of paperwork and hearings and the strange loneliness of living in my sister's spare room at 61 years of age with my mother's prayer book on the nightstand. I will tell you the moments that mattered. I will tell you about the afternoon my son Ethan flew home from Calgary without telling me he was coming, and I opened Francis's front door to find him standing on the porch in his work parka, 6'3" of him, and he said, "Mom, why didn't you call me?" And I said, "Son," because I was trying to figure out what kind of mother I needed to be, and he walked into the kitchen and he picked up Francis's phone and he called his father and he said, in a voice I had never heard him use in his life, "Dad, I am taking Mom's side in this and you are not going to change my mind, so do not bother trying." I will tell you about the day Jessica Baudouin won the motion to have the false will thrown out of probate. The judge, a woman from Hamilton who had been practicing law longer than I had been a nurse, looked down at Bruce and Douglas and Colleen sitting at the respondents' table and she said, in a voice cold enough to freeze the street, "Lawrence, that in 41 years on the bench, she had rarely seen a more shameful attempt to defraud a widow who was not even aware she was one." I will tell you about the morning in May when the Crown laid charges against Douglas for fraud over $5,000 and uttering a forged document, and against Bruce and Colleen as parties to the offense. The paralegal in Hamilton had already flipped on all three of them in exchange for a reduced sentence. Douglas did not take the stand in his own defense. I will tell you about the afternoon I walked back into the house on Larkspur Lane for the first time in 7 months. Bruce had moved out. Ethan came with me. My key still worked in the front lock. The chickadee feeder in the back garden was empty. The first thing I did was fill it. The criminal trial ran through the autumn. Douglas received 2 years less a day in provincial custody. Bruce and Colleen each received 18 months of house arrest and 200 hours of community service on the condition that they attend weekly sessions with a counselor who specialized in elder financial abuse. I did not go to the sentencing. Ethan went. He told me, afterwards, that his father had tried to catch his eye as he was led out of the courtroom, and that he had looked at the wall instead. By the terms of Harold's real will, all 3 of his biological children had contested the estate, and all 3 of them therefore lost their shares. Harold's entire estate, every dollar, every deed, every share, came to me. I will tell you what I did with it, because the people in the comments of stories like mine always want to know, and they are right to ask. I kept the house at 42 Larkspur Lane because that house was my home and I was not going to let anyone drive me out of it a second time. I sold the cottage on Lake Simcoe, and I put the money in trust for Ethan, the way Harold had wanted, with the stipulation that his future children would be welcome there, even if their Whitfield cousins were not. I kept enough in my own RRSP and a modest GIC ladder at the credit union to live on for the rest of my life, without ever having to worry again. I am a frugal woman. I was a nurse for 22 years, and I know how to stretch a loonie. And then I took the rest, which came to something over $900,000, and I called Jessica Baudouin, and I said, "Help me set up a foundation." The Harold Whitfield Caregiver Support Fund opened its doors last summer in a small office on Wyndham Street in downtown Guelph. It provides stipends, respite funding, and legal advice to live-in family caregivers across Wellington County. Last month, we helped a woman in Elora named Denise get her name put back on the title of the house she had been caring for her mother in, after her brother tried to pull the same stunt on her that Bruce had tried to pull on me. Denise came into the office, and she cried at my desk, and I handed her a box of Kleenex, and I told her what Mrs. Henderson had told me in that recovery room in Kitchener 20 years ago, about not letting them do it a second time. I am 62 years old now. My son comes home from Calgary at Christmas and at Thanksgiving, and he brings a young woman named Priya who is an engineer and who laughs at my jokes. I have not spoken to Bruce in 14 months. I do not expect to again. I fill the chickadee feeder every morning, and I drink my Tim Hortons coffee on Tuesdays, and I wear Eleanor's locket under my sweater every day of my life. The very last thing in Harold's envelope, underneath the letter and the USB stick and the photocopy of the real will, was something I have not mentioned until now. It was a second, shorter note written on a piece of lined paper torn from a grocery list pad. It was in Harold's handwriting, but shakier, the hand of a man who was very close to the end. It said only this: "Margaret, my Eleanor used to say that a family is not the people whose blood you share. A family is the people who show up. You showed up for me every day for 12 years. I am sorry I could not protect you while I was alive. I hope I have found a way to protect you now." I keep that note folded in the drawer of my nightstand, next to my mother's prayer book. I read it on the nights when the house is quiet and the snow is coming down outside my window, and I start to wonder whether the woman I used to be, the young nurse from Fergus who married a boy from Guelph in 1992, would recognize the woman I have become. She would. I think she would. She would tell me that I did right by the old man, and I did right by myself, and somewhere in between those two things is the whole of a good life.